So now let's begin our workshop, Neither Criminal Nor Cop, a Broader Critique. This will be a compelling conversation about experiencing criminalization and a path that led to promoting changes within the criminal justice system. I'm the moderator. My name is Amanda Dodge, and I'm the program director here at MCC Saskatchewan. And I'm just delighted to introduce our two speakers, two people who I have much respect, admiration, and affection for. So I'll start with Beverly Fullerton. Beverly is the Community Justice Liaison Worker at the Community Legal Assistance Services for Saskatoon Inner City, the acronym for which is CLASSIC. Beverly is a Métis woman, born and raised in Saskatoon. Beverly is a survivor of child and sexual abuse, the foster care and juvie system, domestic violence. She is a recovering drug addict, ex-gang member, and was sentenced to a federal prison of 5 years. Beverly believed she deserved a better life. With hard work and determination, she was able to alter the path she was on. Today, Beverly is the Community Justice Liaison Worker at CLASSIC, and she's in her first year of studies for Bachelor of Indigenous Social Work at the First Nations University of Canada. And I currently get to work with Beverly at the Anti-Racism Network's Justice Committee, and it's a joy to see her advocacy in action. Our second speaker is Dan LeBlanc, a lawyer and owner of LeBlanc Law and a Regina City Councillor. Dan grew up with an imprisoned father and a hardworking mother who struggled to make ends meet. He organically came by his belief that Saskatchewan society treats some families better than others. He became a lawyer to stand with marginalized folks, and on rare occasions lives up to his high ideals. Of course, that's Dan's bio in his own words. I got to work with Dan back in the day when he was a student at CLASSIC and I was a lawyer there, and he, of course, was a star student. And it's been such a delight to see him indeed living up to his ideals in his social justice-oriented practice. So welcome, Beverly and Dan. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And the way that this session will work is that it will be like a facilitated conversation between Beverly and Dan, starting with their own further introductions of themselves and then led by framing questions. Beverly and Dan invite your questions and comments throughout. So if you have a comment or question to share, you can feel free to pop that in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature in Zoom, which if you're unfamiliar with it, it's down on that button called reactions. And then there's a button you can press that says raise hand. So it just would signify to myself, Beverly and Dan, that you'd like to share something, and then you can lower that hand as well and to be called on. And to speak, of course, to unmute yourself and share your question or comment. So Beverly and Dan had expressed their preference for it to be more conversational during the workshop. And if we do have time at the end for questions and answers, that's great too. So let's begin. Beverly and Dan, please start by sharing more detailed introductions of yourselves.
Good morning. I'm pretty sure I volunteered to start first, and I'm always nervous the first few minutes, but I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm just so happy to be here, and thank you for the invite. It's always lovely to see you, Amanda, as well. So yeah, as Amanda mentioned, a quick bio. My name is Beverly. I am from Saskatoon here. I was born and raised to alcoholic parents. You know, my stepfather and my father are both products of, well, survivors of the residential school system. My mom is a white woman from British Columbia whose father is a World War II vet, but brought home a lot of PTSD and then, had trickled down to her. So she received a lot of abuse. Growing up, I never heard "I love you" as a child. I didn't know what a hug was. It was a very toxic home, but it was normal to me, right? So there was daily abuse. There was, the alcoholism, the friends coming in, and, it was a tough childhood. So growing into my teens, it was a survival mode. I didn't know that I didn't know skills. I didn't know tools. All I knew was that I didn't fit in anywhere, and I didn't know how to fit in anywhere. So I became a people pleaser. I was a manipulator. I just tried to survive. So I've been on my own since I was 14 years old. I was thrown out, and by thrown out, literally, my stepdad threw me off a second floor balcony when I was 14, and that was the last time I was at home. And so homeless at 14, finding, the people that I could fit in with on the streets, never really knowing how to be loved or how to love. I didn't know what that actually felt like. I heard the words, I've watched movies, I had a fantasy of what it was, but I didn't know how to obtain it or how to even remotely closely get to it. So I fell into addiction. I fell into, really unhealthy relationships. I was on the streets for many years, and so by being on the street, it comes with, doing drugs. I fell into a phase of, working in the streets. By that, so being a sex worker, being in the sex trade. There was many resources and organizations within Saskatoon at that time that tried helping me, but I wasn't ready for that help. I just thought anybody that wanted to help me had a hidden motive, right? And so I didn't know how to trust anybody. So going into my young adult years, I got into really unhealthy relationships. My first relationship, I have 2 beautiful children with him. He was, again, him too. He was also a survivor of day schools, and his family, all residential school survivors, and brought all of the trauma into our relationship. So that didn't end well. We have 2 beautiful children. And, unfortunately for him, he passed away a few years ago to drinking and driving. So we were unable to break that cycle in time for him. And so leading into that, still not finding my way, not knowing which way to go, I fell into more and more domestic abuse relationships. The one I was found in Chamberlain in a ditch by 2 young adults that thought I was dead. This past relationship had beat me so bad in his car, and he left me in a ditch to die. I had to be identified in the hospital by my fingerprints. And so surviving that and coming back out of that, wanting to live. I didn't want to die. I wasn't ready to die. I have my children. At that time, I have, 3 children, another one on the way. I just didn't want my children to be experiencing. I knew deep down that I wanted to provide for my family. So then my next relationship, knight in shining armor. I thought at the time, however, but not in a good, I don't know how to say that in a good way, but so he was a gang leader. He was he formed this really the most violent gang in Saskatoon right now. He was the leader of that. He, started bringing people in. And so for me to be chosen as his woman, I felt that I was deserving of this, right? And so I fell into the gang life really fast. Had all my children with us. We were entrenched in the lifestyle. I, was very violent. I delivered violent acts. I wreaked havoc on our community. But my thoughts at that time was the community didn't care about me. This was my place. This was all I was worth. This was all I was going to be able to give in this life. I did not feel worthy of a good life. I didn't know what a good life was. What did that look like? Well, it ended in those years. My 6-month-old son passed away to a misdiagnosis in the hospital. We were turned away from the hospital 8 times over a 3-day weekend. And, he ended up passing away at home in my arms. From what they told me was a viral, it ended up being, double bacterial bronchial pneumonia. So after having that and fighting the systems with the racism and with, just not being heard, I became more against the system. And then, my brother was murdered by a gang member, and it just unraveled, right? It just spiraled right out of control, and it ended up where, my home was raided with all my children in the home. There was no care about being kind to us while we were being raided. And, I ended up being served a 5-year federal sentence. And it was in there that I was the most alone. I was forced to look at Beverly. I was forced where I didn't have an unhealthy relationship. I wasn't putting all my energy somewhere else. And I wasn't being, I was forced to look into Bev and who I was. I hid behind the mother role, thought I was being a great mom, but yet I was traumatizing my children more than I was traumatized growing up. And so how do I live with that? I had to find forgiveness. So I just prayed. I prayed, and I connected with elders, and I was so lost, and I just knew I didn't want to go back to where I was. So I worked my butt off, and my work every day is a struggle. Like in those years, I was addicted. Like I was a drug user. I was a crackhead. I was every label you could think of. I've been through that label, and I was that label, and I carry that today as experience. I was fortunate to connect with some amazing organizations in the community that were able to guide me and hold my hand and give me those wraparound services. Because there's many days where I'm like, I don't know if I'm doing this. Still today, I'm 10 years on a good path. But I'm like, when's it going to crash? When's this, when's this dream going to unfold? But really, it's the hard work and the determination. I'm trying to be mindful of time. I could talk for hours on my story. But yeah, so, I came back to the city, and I was the very first woman on the high-risk parole officer's case. The city police didn't want me back in the city. However, they were not quick enough to get in the ban for me to return here. And the conditions that were imposed on me were set up to make me fail. If I jaywalked while I was on parole, I was going back to prison. All I knew was I didn't want to go back to prison. Still to this day, I can remember the feeling of sitting in segregation, crying and having the guards laugh at me, being like, nice choices, hey, Bev, what are you going to do now? But there was a lot of words that stuck with me. One of the things I really pushed for when I was in segregation, I spent 6 months in segregation at the last part of my sentence, was I got my grade 12. I was tired of being told that I was useless. I was never going to amount to nothing. I was waste of breath on this earth. And I had nobody to prove it to but to myself. I'm like, I can't be all these awful things people are saying about me. So when I was back in the city, the gang strategy forum started developing, and I was contacted being like, hey, Bev, do you want to use your voice? Come to the table. And I got out of the gang I don't know how I'm here today to tell my story and not have to worry about walking down Saskatoon. I have a good relationship with the way I was able to exit the gang. So to carry that with me to share with, our youth that are involved in with gangs or possibly going to gangs, that's my passion, is because I know it. I know the codes, I know everything that falls with it, right? And it's not as easy as people say, oh, just get out of the gang, or, oh, they just joined the gang. Like, there's so much underlying issues to it. So to be able to speak to it is, I find myself fortunate to be a voice for that. I started working with the Elizabeth Fry Society as the Tuesday night sharing circle, really started connecting with the women in the community and relating and understanding and seeing how some workers would work with women and be like, well, why didn't you just do this? Or, you need to follow through with this. And I'm like, there's so much more that we need to do that we're missing. And I became the reintegration worker. So I was working with women who were behind those walls, coming from the prisons and into the community. Anyways, my path has been amazing. Doors have been opening up. I took a position at Classic Law because I was like, this is an opportunity where I'm going to learn a whole new language, right? Like, if I want to be this advocate, I really need to understand all areas. And so I'm working in, at Classic, and I'm working with these lawyers, and they're talking languages I don't understand. I know they're talking good, but, so learning, and then sitting there being, I want to give more. I want to be more in our community. I want to deliver these programs. I want to make those changes. I want to fight the colonial systems and help decolonize. How do I do this? I chose to take the big leap and head back to university. So I'm here today. I've survived. I don't know how, but I know I'm here, and I'm a huge, huge advocate and a believer in storytelling, story sharing. And I just love whenever I have an opportunity to talk, to have conversations, to answer questions. I believe I'm here for a reason. So that is a little bit about me, and I know I'll get more into it as we talk more. And I'll pass it over to Dan.
Great. Thanks, Beverly. Yeah, so my story growing up as part of what I'll call a criminalized family. My father was a young man and ended up in an intimate partner relationship and taking the life of his partner. And that was an Indigenous woman, and that is part of the long line of violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. He got fed into the system, essentially, and at the time in Quebec where he was living, there was no legal aid system. So what that meant is he was basically up against the government or the state without legal representation. And as I understand it, what the Crown prosecutor at the time told him is, you can either plead not guilty and we'll go to trial and we'll pursue capital murder, so for a death sentence, which was available in Canada at the time, or you can plead guilty to non-capital murder, and essentially we would agree that you'll get a life sentence. And so, sorry, I'm just seeing about the internet. I apologize. I did, yeah. And so he did end up pleading guilty to non-capital murder and was issued a life sentence. And what that means is essentially for the remainder of your life, you're at the direction of the federal government. So not always you're within a prison wall, but that they'll decide where you live and you have to apply when you want to get out. So that happened before I was born, and then he met my mother. They got married. They had 3 kids, 2 of whom are on this call, and we grew up in a situation where our dad was either out of prison in the household on parole, which meant he had some conditions to comply with, and then regularly was getting, in my view, at the time, sort of getting picked up on charges of varying seriousness and brought back into prison. And so growing up as a young kid, we would regularly go to the PA penitentiary to visit him and, see him at visiting hours or end up calling him, to chat, that sort of thing. And so from my perspective, we really grew up in a context where criminalization of our father was like a central motivating factor. And part of what that did, for me at least psychologically, is sort of make our family feel like we were kind of marked, like the Canadian state had picked us out as a family who was on the wrong side of the law, who ought to be watched more closely, who are unlikely to amount to much, that sort of thing. And in many ways for me, that made me think the options available to me were quite constrained, in that kids of prisoners don't have many options, that sort of thing. And I think of a related part of it that has to be spoken about is sort of the experience of the partner on the outside. So in that case, my mom, which is jail, setting that up. I might just turn off my video until I can sort the internet. I apologize. Sastel, I thought you could count on the crowns, but you can't. Yeah, so that was a large part of it, is feeling that way, and then the experience on the outside. And a large part of the way that felt to me was that there were few options. So at some point, essentially, I formed the view, and I think pretty young, that my family was sort of marked both from a prison perspective as well as economically, that we weren't the sort of family that most of Saskatchewan population was concerned about. And I started in some ways going down a similar road to my dad. So when I was about 12, a few friends and I started doing break and enters around our hometown, and got a fair amount of money, several $1,000s in cash from within there. And at one point we went into a house we'd been in before and went into the drawer where we previously retrieved the money, and suddenly had ink all over our hands. And what had happened is the RCMP had essentially worked with the family whose house it was to plant ink. And then we, the 12-year-olds, panicked and tried to wipe it off across the wall, and of course left our fingerprints everywhere. So we ended up getting charged with break and enter, which in Canada is quite a serious offense, even as a kid. And I ended up having to go before court in Rostron Provincial Court with my mom. And I remember leaving that morning with my mom and saying, essentially, well, however this goes, I'm going to come back and pack my clothes. And she said, no, like, it's entirely possible that you leave the courtroom in handcuffs. And luckily for me, is my mom knew the Crown prosecutor assigned to my file and basically negotiated a sweetheart deal. And the prosecutor thought that if I was her kid, I couldn't be so bad and I couldn't be beyond hope. And so I got a sweetheart deal with just community service. And that point really stuck out to me, like the discretionary nature of what prosecutors and the court system do is that if my mom wasn't my mom, or the Crown didn't know me, or I was an Indigenous kid, I likely would have spent time inside a prison for children. And that would be quite a different trajectory than the one I'm on. And so that struck me, the way in which different families can get treated differently, and government representatives get to decide who gets criminalized, even if many people do criminal acts, so-called. So speeding up a few years, I suppose, I remained of the view that our sort of prison and economic systems were inequitable and were unfair to families like mine. And at some point, I started going to university, which I didn't think I would have been able to do. And I started getting okay grades at the university, and I realized I had good enough grades to get into either law school or social work. And I didn't know which to do to sort of most benefit people like my dad and people like my family. So I went to speak with him one day when I was in university. He was at the Regional Psychiatric Center at that time, which notably is on the University of Saskatchewan campus. I think it's the only campus with a prison. And I was speaking to him in there and said, I could be a social worker or a lawyer. In your experience, which of those can be most helpful? And he told me, in his experience, a lawyer is like a social worker with a club, in that they can force people to treat others humanely rather than simply having to asking them to do that. And that was compelling to me. And so I decided to go into law and worked at Classic a little bit with Amanda and others. And that was a great experience. But my time since then, I suppose I'd say two things. One is law school, like the legal system, tries very hard to convince people that it is neutral, that we criminalize only people who act badly, and we criminalize all people who act badly, when in fact, I think we see that has a lot of overlaps with class and race and access to power in various ways. And so some of the work I've been trying to do is resisting that narrative, and as much as I can do without losing my license to practice law, telling people outside of the legal system that that's how the legal system operates. And there are pretty significant constraints around what you can say. But that has been part of my work, is sort of economically getting into politics to try to improve those sort of systemic causes of criminalization. And then on the legal side, once someone is criminalized, trying to work with them to improve access to fairness, both inside prison and then when they're let out. So that's a little bit about me, and apologize for the connection.
Thank you both for sharing so vulnerably and openly with us. It's moving now into the questions that that you've developed to frame the conversation. You both talk about being criminalized. It's part of your personal story, but you've named systemic issues and the membership of a group, a criminalized group, your families and larger social groups, in addition to being criminalized as an individual. What could you tell us about being raised as part of a criminalized group? And are there differences between how criminalized and non-criminalized folks behave?
I think for me, how I was criminalized was, being raised in poverty, right? I didn't have the backup or the support. So when being raised, going to school and not, even just from peers, I'm coming in hand-me-down clothes or whatever, I'm already racialized, or I'm already profiled, and then going into my adult years, being on welfare or the social assistance program, I'm already judged, like I'm collecting a check. And it's just, and when I got involved with, as a teenager, going through the juvie system. So I spent, a good 2 years out of my, teenage years in and out of prison, like out of the juvie system here at Kilburn Hall and open custody. So that followed me. So even if I was just walking out in public, I would get pulled over and cops knew who I was. Oh, hey, Beverly, you up to no good today, and then that followed me into my adulthood, right? Because Beverly's known on the street. Me too, as with Dan, break and enters were just, and that's what I did. It was just an easy way to get into someone's house. But like I said, it was all by survival. I didn't have the family to be like, hey, Beverly, like, let's try and get you educated and do something well with this. Sorry, I'm trying to get back. Dan, you can pop in anytime here and just kind of keep me on track with that question. But, so when I got into the gang life, the involvement of the folks that were involved with me, there was no way I was doing good at all or anything. So as soon as I left my house, I would be pulled over. My car would be searched, I would be questioned, and it was continuously. I could be driving my kids to school at 8 a.m. and a cop would be following me. I'm up to no good, but I'm also like, even if I'm doing good, it still doesn't feel like I'm, and so when I went to prison, who Beverly was on paper was who I was. No matter the amount of programming I did, which doesn't work for folks in prison because it's the same programming for every single person in there and it's just a checkbox. They're not getting right in there and working with what's the issues, like what are the underlying issues. But prison didn't help me change. The programs didn't change me, right? And it was at the end of the day, I was always accused of being a manipulator. I was always accused of lying. I was always accused of Beverly's just going to go back to her old ways. Don't waste time on her. But like I said, it was something that was within me that really wanted to get out of that label. And for years when I came home in 2014, it has still been that. Like I had cops following me. So Bev, when are you gonna F up? When are you gonna fuck up? Come on, we're on a time here. And the one cop joked, yeah, we got a pool going on here. Who's like, when you're gonna go back? It took forever for me to just keep my nose, just to stay focused. And today still, I don't know if I still look like I'm still looked at as Beverly, the gang member. As hard as I'm working, I wonder if I'm really cleared of the labels I used to have. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I think those are good thoughts. I mean, for me, in terms of how it was growing up in it, I think part of how it was framed by sort of society writ large was that my dad was bad and society was good. And it was up to me to pick a path. And to some extent, I think there's this really strong idea that both the prison culture, but also the economic culture puts forward, which is that this system is always unquestionably good. And people who fail under it, which can look like going to prison or being on social assistance, have done it because they are bad. And the stark choice to be made is to sort of fall in line and to become a booster of the system proper. And so I think that was a big part of the narrative provided to me. And for me, at least, that never rang true, because I think I had this sense that the system, prison and economic, had sort of unfairly targeted our family. And so the system itself couldn't be fully good. And if my choice was just accept this bad system or don't, I was going to choose the don't path. And there was no sort of creative third option put forward that Beverly and I are talking about today. And so I think that's part of, you know, how it happened that I was doing break and enters and so on, is because I said, I don't believe you, system, when you say that it's a good thing for me to just fall in line and shut up, because I've seen the sort of harm you do. But at the time, I think there was no sort of fertile means for me to resist that system except to break it, essentially. And, you know, that's a strange place, strange, like, constrained choice to be in. And now, as a lawyer and having grown up, I think I have some more fertile means to challenge that system. But that for me was a big part of the narrative, is this stark choice of, are you going to be like your dad, or are you going to fall in line and be a prison guard? And those both seem like bad options to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting how the moralizing and the binary of the good and bad are a big part of the narrative you received, and also that you're like reframing for yourself. And in that binary, you're looking for this third way. You're in the company of Anabaptists who like to talk about the third way, and I think we'd love to hear more about you know, the system which criminalized you and the group of which you're a part, and how it framed itself as good. And how did you find that third way between, like, either falling in line or going against? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for me, well, it wasn't clear at the time how the system was framing itself as good, but I think the main way it did it actually is by framing people who step offside of it as bad, and then saying we're the opposite of bad. We're the ones who protect others from bad people. And so I think that's a big part of how it frames itself as good. And one of the things that struck me, I think, growing up, and some of this is from hearing from my dad, is stories about bad people inside that system. So stories about cops who treat people badly, or prison guards who are, you know, malicious in putting people in solitary, and so on. And so I think part of it for me was a nuancing then of saying, probably neither the criminals nor the cops are all good or all bad, but certainly there are some bad things about the cops and courts and crowns that we can and should resist. And, you know, now some of the way I see it played out, like a little bit more as a lawyer, is I occasionally watch videos of clients being interrogated by police and that sort of thing if they get a criminal charge. And I'll often see police say things to children like, you know, when I came to your house looking for you, your dad was very mad. There was police at the door, and you, child, who I'm interrogating, should be really nervous about anyone who tells you police are bad. We're the good guys. And so they will say it quite explicitly in a way that it wasn't said explicitly to me. But I think at heart, you know, the change came for me in in realizing that police and so on can use their power in really discretionary ways. And it's not true that if someone breaks a crime, they must get treated in a particular way. Actually, like, the people decide how to treat people who break laws, either through criminalizing them or not. And so it always seemed to me, I guess, Mennonite background, that the people who willingly decided to put someone else in a cage when they could have made a different choice are probably not, they probably don't represent a system which is wholly good. And so it can be critiqued in ways that are forceful. And I'll maybe let Beverly hop in there, but then I do have a few thoughts on sort of what happens when the government only gives us these two options to be a cop or a crown, or a cop or a criminal, rather.
Thanks, Dan. Going through the system and also now being like an advocate for folks currently going through the system, I used to utilize my light skin, looking white, compared to, I threw so many other girls under the bus when I was younger, like when we would be approached with the police or like with getting in trouble with ever, because the difference that my Indigenous friend would be treated through the whole process would be different than the way I would get treated at a younger age. So that's where when I say like I used to be a good manipulator, I could manipulate utilizing the way the system's treated the ones around me. Thinking specifically to the criminalized group that I was really a part of, like being a part of the gang life, and I think of a lot of the folks that are still entrenched in it, and picturing them getting out, getting an education and having a job. It's not that easy. So my ex in particular, he's 45, 260 pounds, Indigenous man, long braid. He walks in anywhere, he's immediately being followed by floor walkers if he's in a store. Security's being called if he, says, hey, back off, I'm just here to buy groceries. There was a time when we were together that he dropped everything, handed all power and everything and control over to his right-hand guy, because we had just had a son together after the loss of our other son, and we wanted to try a good life. We worked on making a resume. We tried going down to the employment place downtown, and they were just kind of laughed at him, being like, where are you going to try and get a job? Well, maybe that's, a little over your head. We should try, let's go try, there was a place where you go at 7 a.m. and line up and hopefully, get a day job, right? Like there was just no belief in that he was going to make a change. And so I just remember there was a period where we really tried to do good. We weren't breaking the law. We were, going to the food bank because we had no money for groceries. We weren't doing anything, but we still got looked at differently. We still got treated differently. We still got harassed by the cops. We had police showing up at our house for making things up. Oh, hey, such and such was seen coming here. Is this person here? And we're like, no, there's no one here. Well, do you mind if we look around? And, with the kids seeing it, and it was just normal for them to constantly harass us. And like I said, when my son passed away, like the difference of the way the systems treat the criminalized, like we were in the hospital, my son was barely breathing, and we were told, no, you were told it's viral, why should we listen to you? We listen to every mother's instinct. Do you think we would have we need a doctor? And if we just give everybody who demanded an x-ray, do you think that would be possible? And the one doctor even had told my ex, and he's like, well, don't you guys have your medicine man or something? Can't you do something at home? And like the way we were talked to, it was just demeaning. And I still see it, like the clients that I work with, being in the prison. So I'm a victim of the guard sexual harassment, like the way they would talk to you with a male guard and a woman, and seeing the things and hearing the things. And, so many people think, oh, they're going to prison, they're going to get all the help they need. They're going to get, they're going to come out completely reformed, and they're going to abide by society, and they're going to contribute. Doesn't happen. I just think of the silence so many receive. Even standing in court, I just remember still to my stomach being so sick and being like, Your Honor, I can't leave my children. My children need me. And he's like, well, you should have thought of that before. You should have thought about all of that before. And he's like, you know what? So I'm the first woman in Saskatchewan that was charged with that organized crime act or whatever. He's like, well, I'll make an example of you. It's like, prosecutors wanted 12 years. We're saying, I'm going to give you 5. But if you're back in my courtroom, that's what you're going to be getting. So that fear stuck with me too, right? But I just think of the way we're talked to compared to, I talked to Dan about, I have a friend right now who has a 14-year-old son going to Mount Royal Collegiate in Saskatoon. He has no ties to gangs. She's a single mom, doing her absolute best with 4 kids. Goes to school, he's wearing all black. Cops interrogate him. Oh, are you the newest little gang member? Is this what you're doing? And that's the life you're going to be? What's your name? Yeah, well, we're going to keep an eye on you. This kid had no thought of being in a gang. So now the police put it in his head, I look like a gang member. I might as well try and be one. Everyone else is being one around Saskatoon. His mom has had to intervene how many times because a cop profiled him as a gang member, even though he wasn't. And now the kid's thinking that, hey, maybe this is what I'm supposed to be. So I see it daily. I see the way that people who are criminalized are talked to compared to somebody who looks more privileged or higher end get talked to. So even sitting at the table still, I sit at a lot of tables. Chief Troy Cooper may talk to me with respect, but I can see he'll get more engaged with a different, say with Amanda. I still see the differences, right? And that's why I want to get my degree, because I don't want to be just Beverly with a lived experience. I'm tired of having knowledge and sensing and seeing this stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm just Beverly with a lived experience, still to this day. I do have respect from coworkers and stuff, but I want that degree so I can be taken a little bit more serious. So, but yeah, sorry, Dan, go ahead.
No, not at all. That's great. Yeah, one thing I was going to say is, I think as a kid and now, my view broadly is that the society, the state that criminalizes people isn't good. It's just powerful. And I think that's what a lot of criminalized people know. And I'm often struck by that, actually, like as a way to dissuade kids from breaking the law isn't to say, the police are really good and the criminal code is passed to protect vulnerable people, because that just doesn't have the ring of truth to it. I actually think there's something to be said for just saying, like, the government and the police who enforce their rules are really scary, and they can put you in a prison if you don't do what they want. And so you don't have to think they're good. You just have to do what they want, or at least don't go so much against it that they can put you in this terrible place. And that's a bit more sobering picture of the state, I think, than the state would like to paint itself as. But I think that's the one that, rings more true to kids who grow up with bed bugs in their house and not enough to eat. And so I actually think, in terms of sort of galvanizing people to take responsibility for their lives and to do interesting things, I think that's more the story we ought to be telling, to like knock kids off the path to criminalization. Isn't that you need to be good and that means following what the government wants you to do. It's like, we need you to be safe, and that means not giving them an excuse to put you in solitary. And so I think there are, hard conversations to have there, and conversations I think the state doesn't want people to have, but that they just ring a lot truer to the lived experience of people who have either, like Beverly, been inside, or like me, seen a loved one brought inside. And so I think it's worthwhile highlighting that what they really have over criminalized folks is power rather than sort of moral high ground.
Wow, there's such rich insights in what you're sharing. And I just want to remind folks that Dan and Beverly are welcoming your questions or comments as we go. We've got about 25 minutes left in the workshop. And you've been talking about, through your experiences and through your perspective, like your observations, developing these critiques of the system, of the state, of police, of what's happening in corrections and so on. And so can you talk more about that, about the critiques of the system which criminalizes, that you developed?
Sorry, and I'm going to jump in there, Dan. Just kind of, I know we've talked about this and we've ran through it, but I'm just, you know, I know not all cops are bad. I know some folks, most folks going into, whether it's the correctionals or the penitentiaries or the courthouses, being a lawyer, they go in with, I'm assuming, good intentions. Same with social workers, right? But our systems are so set up that you hit walls. It's policy after policy. You know, you go in there and you want to change the life of somebody, and you can see just the small things that they need. Oh, but that's against policy. You can't do that. You hit so many walls as an employer in that system. And I see it and I hear it almost every day. And, you know, and I just wanted to chime in quickly when Dan was talking about the power of the police and that. And like, I remember sitting in an interrogation room at the police station, and they brought in a woman cop and a bad cop, like the good cop, bad cop, that came in and like, you know, Beverly, this can all just go away tonight. All you have to do is say you were scared of them. Well, you know, we'll pack you and the kids up, we'll get you in witness protection, and, you know, it'll all disappear. And I'm like, but will it really all disappear? Like, what does that mean? And they're like, oh, well, we'll get into details later, you know. But it was, you know, I had that option of no jail time and I could be gone with my kids and everything, but that's the power they have. So why couldn't, you know, we have done something differently? Why couldn't we met in the middle, right? I didn't want to be the rat, because police don't understand that too. Like, if you get that label, you'll also become their tool to go further once you rat to the police, or, you know, give them information. Your whole sense of who you are as a whole person, you lose that power within yourself. But anyways, I'm getting off topic again. When I was on parole, I was struggling with my kids. I had a really, you know, I had my very first job ever. It was not paying very well. I have no family support, right? So I'm also want to say I have 7 kids and a grandson, and I just really want to do good with them. But anyways, I remember struggling, and I had drug and gang unit as my street supervisor, so they would come and do my curfew check. I have a 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. curfew check, right, with 3 kids living at home. But I just remember going into a dark space, because I'm like, how do I do this? How am I supposed to provide for my kids? This isn't working. So I had bad cop, good cop show up, and the good cop, and she brought a bag of groceries. And I was like, what's happening? They showed up at like 5:30, and they're like, hey, Bev, how's it going? It's nice to see you home for curfew. And she has like these superstore bags. I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, yeah, we're here to make some cookies. Let's hang out. And I'm like, what's the catch? Right away, right? And I'm like, she's like, no, let's do something. Let's, you know, you guys are in the house. It's a beautiful evening. Let's put a movie on. Let's make some cookies. We got everything you need. Bad cop standing there, and he's just kind of like, my kids are looking at him. But he finally got into it too. I really believe that it's the not understanding of the story behind the person. Like, I had lots of opportunities to chat with. She's now one of my really good friends. And she's still a drug and gang unit officer. We can meet for lunch and talk about everything but her work and my work. Like, we found a common ground of stuff to talk about. But those happen, and I'm not like, I don't come at systems thinking they're all bad, like everybody's horrible. I know there's folks in there that mean well and want to do well, but our systems are set up with so many barriers and so many walls that I honestly believe it's a job security. I honestly think we don't need that $56 million remand center being built for 250 more beds to keep men in prison. Why couldn't we not have transition homes or healing centers in our community to fill those beds and offer another route? People sitting on remand have not even been found guilty. They have a charge. They may not have, you know, a safe home to go to, but why can't we provide alternatives rather than a prison? You know, so you sit in that prison when you're on remand, you're not getting programming, you're not getting access to, you know, cultural things, or like, and especially with COVID now, it's just, there's so many things broken in our system. And I could sit here, and I remember sitting and talking with Senator Kim Payne. She's like, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? I would help people just with basic skills, basic needs. Like, how do you cook? How about just sitting at a dinner table with like a full course meal? Lots of people don't get that. How about teaching someone how to read a book to your child? We don't know that, right? My mom never read a book. Sorry, I had my littlest guy just found me in the office. I'll let you take over, Dan. But those are so many things that people don't know. They don't have that. They never experienced it. So who are we to expect these expectations on folks? Yes, they stay criminalized because they don't know anything else, but they want to know. But so there's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think for me, some of what makes me think this system is open to critique is seeing how arbitrary the decisions are. So one example, I know when I was working at Classic, there was a client who was a prisoner who a guard had ordered them to, they were laying in bed, a guard had ordered them to get up and pick up a t-shirt and move it onto a different shelf. And the prisoner didn't do it. And the guard had issued the order 3 times and didn't do it. And so sort of internal charge is what they called them was laid. And the offense was essentially not listening to a direct order of a guard. And this guy ended up getting found guilty and spent 10 days in solitary for not getting out of bed to move a t-shirt from A to B for, no apparent reason. But the threat that's implied within that is that I think if you can ignore guards when they tell you to do things that have no purpose, maybe you're also defiant when it really matters. And, that to me is an example of what I've seen where it's sort of just the arbitrary exercise of power or other things like, certainly I've seen in my work as a lawyer, people will get charged with more things than the police could ever prove to the criminal standard. So like the law speak about it, you might call it like overcharging. And then a way to think about that, and I think some Crown prosecutors do, is that that's sort of a first negotiating position. And so in the end, let's say they have 10 charges, you whittle that down to 2, you plead guilty to. They're pretty happy with that, but they knew those 8 charges didn't have a hope anyway. And so it's sort of artificially enhancing the strength of their hand in the negotiation. And that strikes me as, deeply arbitrary and actually like deeply, deeply malicious. I think one more just from my experience in law that highlights it for me and plays in a bit with this idea that the system not only wants to have other people think it is good, but needs to think of itself as good. Is I had a client once who we'll call Anne, and she was charged with something that she told me she didn't do, but she was very confident she would be found guilty of it because she was an Indigenous woman. And so she had told me, just plead guilty to it because I don't have a hope, and negotiate a good deal with the Crown. But there are rules around what you can and can't plead guilty to. And as a lawyer, you can't plead guilty to something unless your client admits they did it. And so we were in this situation where Anne knew she would be found guilty, but couldn't plead guilty because she knew she was innocent. And so we had to plead not guilty and go to trial. And then she predictably lost at trial. And then the judge held it against her that she pled not guilty in the first place. And that to me really highlights some of the strangeness of this when the system so almost compulsively needs to think of itself as good. And it can't admit that most of what it's doing is just exercising power over people like Anne. That I think if the system was honest with itself there, it would say, okay, Anne, submit to our power, plead guilty, and let us do what we want. But it has to sort of prop up this image that actually, because it's untrue, harms people like that. And, you know, so those are some of the arbitrary actions that make me think there's not sort of a unifying goodness behind what they do. And one more point about what flows from that, which is, because I think the system isn't mostly good, and that our prison system interacts in pretty intermeshed ways with our economic system. So poor people go to jail and so on. I think it's a really strange system for us to look to, for poor and criminalized people to look to for any sort of justice or rehabilitation. So one example is, I had a criminal defense client who was charged with assaulting an intimate partner, a man charged with assaulting a woman, and the woman didn't attend the court date that she was supposed to testify against this guy. And so they had to drop the charge, basically. And then the prosecutor afterwards, I heard telling the police, you should now go arrest this woman because she missed the court date. And maybe you should do it on a Friday so she has to spend the weekend in jail before a bail hearing. And that's the sort of implication for me of, here we have two criminalized people in a relationship together, and if the only system for fairness that's presented to that abused woman is to go to the system that abuses her, that's very strange, you know. And so part of, I think, the work Beverly and I and the organizations we work for are trying to do is to think about, what does justice look like outside of those things, and can we work for economic justice? So, for example, abused women have options beyond just going to the same court that might sentence them later to get their partner in trouble, that sort of thing.
I just wanted to follow quickly. Oh, sorry, Matt. I was listening to Dan talk. And so, like, my last official charge was 2011, picked up another one. But anyways, 3 things that have been following me since, and this is where that power comes with. So when my baby had passed away, you know, we had reached out to a lawyer. We looked at, you know, nobody wanted to apologize. So I was looking at a civil suit, you know, made the paper, whatever, was actually following through, had found a lawyer out of Regina that was willing to work the case with us because there was just a lot of evidence that there was neglect in the hospital, you know. And so as this is spanning out, I end up in prison. And, you know, it's a Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and there's a thing over the intercom, Beverly, Fullerton to the social area, whatever. So I head up there, and there's 4 police officers sitting there. And I'm like, oh my God, now what, right? And so I sit down, they're like, Beverly Fullerton? I'm like, yes. And then there's a gentleman in a suit. He's like, it's our understanding that you're pursuing, you know, a lawsuit against, you know, College of Medicine, University of Saskatchewan, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, okay, so we've come to discuss this with you. If you decide to pursue this, these officers are here to now charge you with neglect causing death, child neglect causing death. And they said that because of my lifestyle of being a gang member, of exposing my children, that it was actually my fault that he was sick, that I wasn't able to prevent that. So on that day, I withdrew everything for that lawsuit, and they didn't charge me, right? So the system won there, you know. And then a second one was leading up to the years when I was, you know, charged with, you know, being involved in the gang and selling drugs. Even though I shouldn't say it, I knew a lot of it, and I did do my part. As soon as we pled guilty and it was determined that X amount of dollars were made for proceeds, but I was on social services, I'm sitting again in prison, police come, and I'm charged with fraud over $5,000. I'm charged with fraud over $5,000 because I didn't declare that income to social services. The drug money that was there, I didn't declare it. And even though I wasn't making all that money and that money was going to the other guys or whoever collected it, I took the downfall because I was on assistance. So I'm still paying off $28,000 a month, or $28,000, which I'm paying $50 a month until it's paid off. If I miss one payment, it goes to CRA and they garnish everything and I can be charged again. So I'm carrying that, right? And like when Don was saying, as an abusive woman, the last time that I was assaulted, when it was going through the court system and that man was being charged with attempted murder, but I was known as as one of his victims, because I wasn't able to prove, I don't know how I was supposed to prove the last blow was from him. He walked. So he was released and I was still at the courthouse. And then there was a cop laughing, oh, you guys will be kissing and make it up soon. So, you know, like those injustices happen. And so my voice, because I know those injustices are there, sorry, I have my little guy here, the realities of what really goes on with that power and control, I don't attack the systems, I call them on their shit. Sorry for language. That's what I want to do, because at the end of the day, who's really being truthful? I'm sorry, I'm going to believe my criminalized community over the officers. So I just wanted to share. Sorry, my little guy's feeling a heck of a lot better. We've had a couple of weeks with him, but those are a few examples that I personally experienced and I still see happening every single day. An example, quickly, I received a call from an institutional man, a man in the institution who was institutionally charged. He couldn't get off his bed, like Dan was saying, was charged with refusing a direct order. The guards grabbed him by his braid and dragged him down the hallway and threw him into segregation, and vowed that because he refused a direct order, because during COVID times, he wasn't feeling good and couldn't get off his bed in time. Why? Why treat another human being like that? It's just, yeah, there's so many examples. We could probably have a 2-day conference on just examples there, Amanda.
You've been speaking so incisively to the violence you've experienced and witnessed and what led you to critique the systems and to be challenging them. And so as we close, we have about 8 minutes left of our workshop. Can you speak to a few of these things? Are there benefits to having formerly criminalized folks doing this kind of justice advocacy? Are there risks as well as benefits? Part of your story is critiquing a system and that you're now no longer a part of. And so do you think that that you would have gotten out of that if you hadn't realized that the system had flaws? And lastly, are there any lessons in this for how to open up interesting possibilities for other criminalized folks? So it's a lot, but we've got 7 minutes. Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me is just thinking about what should criminalized people do when they have the option to get out of being criminalized. So I think there's parallels. Like, I know one author I like, Paulo Freire, he talks about it for basically like poor people in Brazil, which is if you're raised poor in Brazil at the time and then you get the chance to be rich, do you then live like any other rich person, or do you sort of stick around to help the poor folks in the way you were raised? And I think there's a similar question for criminalized and formerly criminalized folks, which is, do you either, I mean, there is a fourth way. You could become a cop or a criminal or someone who critiques, or, you know, you could be an accountant and just not really be involved with the system whatsoever. And I think that's a live question. And for me, there is a lot of value of having people who have experienced the system directly, in both the ways that Beverly and I have, being part of critiquing that system, which is that we have what I might call like forbidden knowledge about the system, and there's something worthwhile about sharing that with people who otherwise don't have access, because I think we can accurately describe sort of one corner of the state in ways that other people have a difficult time doing. And I guess another way I might frame that is, yeah, we can describe the contours of sort of the lived reality of our system. So one example of a way I try to do that in my legal work sometimes is occasionally I will take files for causes I believe in, but that I know are doomed to run into a brick wall at court. And I will say, right now, if you asked people, does this brick wall exist for people like you? They would probably say no. And so let's collectively run headlong into it to sort of show people that there's a wall there. And then you folks can communicate about why there shouldn't be a wall there. And I think that's one of the interesting things I think that people with lived experience can bring to this work. I think there are risks, like for me at least. Well, I'm a lawyer and a city councillor, so that involves voting on a police budget. And because I do this work, I am very nervous when I see police. Like I think they are protected enough by legislation and in courts that they could physically harm me without suffering much by way of retribution. And so despite all of the power that I can now access on these various things, but also as a lawyer and a city councillor, I still feel targeted in some way, and that I continue to put that target on my back by doing this work. But what I know is there are lots of folks who are formally criminalized or continually criminalized who would be at much higher risk to say than I am to say the same things, and I think they ought to be said. So I think there are for sure risks of it, but the possibilities outweigh those. So those are my responses. Yeah.
Real quick, as soon as I knew that I had a voice and there was people that were going to listen, I decided I was going to use it. Am I scared to piss anybody off? No. I will use my voice and speak my mind and be as honest as I can. And I've kind of gotten that reputation in our community, but in a good way, in a respectful way. I try to deliver it in a way where I can have those conversations in safe spaces, and then, try to help others understand. When I realized that the systems weren't good, that's when I decided to see if I could help and be a part of that change and encourage the people around me and my community to also use their voices and to speak up. Sorry. I just think if you speak your truth, and that's all I keep encouraging the folks around me, and be kind. So.
Wonderful. We do have a couple minutes. Does anyone have a question or comment for Beverly or Dan? Feel free to unmute yourself or pop it in the chat.
I have a comment, I guess, just both for Beverly and Dan. I really appreciate this. I didn't even know what was going on. Dan is my brother. He's not a great communicator, so I didn't know this was going on until I saw it on his Facebook page. But I'm glad this happened. It was really interesting. And Beverly, your stories were really interesting and enlightening. And Dan, I just had a comment about when you were caught with the ink on your hands. I remember that day so well. And I didn't know you were doing any of this, but I remember we were like in the driveway. I'm just like a year older than Dan. And Dan comes biking up and he's got ink all over his hands. He's like, oh my God, Lise. He was like, a pen exploded all over my hands, but there's cops in town looking for people who stole money. I'm like, what? Like, why would you even know that? Where did this pen come from? He's like, just tell mom a pen exploded. Okay. So that's my comments on that.
Well, that's a great way to close us out, Lise. Thank you. And just a very, very warm thank you to both of you, Beverly and Dan, for your sharing the vulnerability of your stories and the incisive teachings from your experience. We are deeply grateful to you. And so thank you from us and from everyone in this room.